Hello, how are you doing? It is a really lovely sunny day here in London. Now, I have to admit, I've not been doing much reading recently because I've been so busy writing. As I talked about in my last reading wrap-up video, I've been commissioned to write 2 books, which is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm really enjoying the experience. But as you can imagine, it's very time-consuming, especially on top of my full-time job that I do, that I call my work, in addition to my work writing these books. And that doesn't leave a lot of reading time, so I'm really looking forward to, in the near future, hopefully being able to settle down with some good books and just enjoying reading again. And in addition to prize lists that have been coming out that I want to be reading, there's a number of really wonderful looking new books that have been just published in March here in the UK, and publishers have sent me a number of them. So I wanted to take out a little bit of time to discuss these books and why I'm so excited to get to them. First off, there's When I Sing Mountains Dance by Irene Sola, and it's translated from the Catalan by Mara Fay Lethem. And this takes place in a small village in the Pyrenees and follows a family that experiences a number of tragedies, very dramatic tragedies in their lives. But in addition to being about their family life, this is about the natural environment of the Pyrenees and describes that. And this has such a beautiful cover. It seems so evocative of exploring that nature in that environment, and just sounds like a really wonderful story that I want to get lost in. The author, Max Porter, says, "This book made me swoon, translated with great musicality, tenderness, and wit. When I Sing Mountains Dance is thirst-quenching literature of the best kind, rich and ranging, shimmering with human and non-human life, utterly universal, deadly funny, and profoundly moving." He knows how to give a good blurb, doesn't he? Another new novel from this region of the world is The Wonders by Elena Medell, translated from the Spanish by Lizzie Davis and Thomas Bunstead. And this is the story of 2 different women's lives and how they're closely connected to each other, but they've never met, because one is a woman that is living in the last years of Franco's regime, and she is the grandmother of the other woman who's living in modern-day Madrid. And it's following their separate lives, but how there are certain themes that connect their lives to each other, and obviously they're related to each other. And it just sounds like such a wonderful story in a moving way to portray a family. And also this has an absolutely gorgeous cover, and it has a blurb on the back by Avni Doshi that wrote Burnt Sugar, which is a novel I absolutely loved, and she calls this mesmerizing. Medell's prose is hypnotic. It's hard to believe this is her first novel. I was completely engrossed in the story, in the shadow each generation casts on the one that comes after it. Good Intentions by Qasim Ali, and this is the story of a couple named Nur and Yasmina, and how they've been together for years. They're very happy with each other, but Nur has never told his family that he is in this relationship or that she exists, and so he finally gets up the courage to admit this to them, which has been very difficult because he's a second-generation immigrant son in Britain. His parents are Pakistani and have a lot of expectations placed upon him, and so he knows that they won't approve of his having a black girlfriend, and so it's getting over his fear of that and discussing it with his family and admitting that he's in this relationship. I also have a few books which all happen to have been written by musicians. So first off, there's a book I'm so excited about, which is Run, Rose, Run by Dolly Parton and James Patterson. So Dolly Parton may not have been nominated for this year's Women's Prize, as I was kind of playfully hoping that she might be, but I am still really excited to read this novel because it's written by Dolly Parton, but also by James Patterson. I don't know how much the actual writing process was divvied up between them. I sort of assume it's mostly James Patterson because actually he came to Dolly Parton with the idea for this novel, which is about a woman that moves to Nashville, and she's a young, aspiring musician. She has a lot of talent, but she's running away from something, and she's running towards something. And you can just imagine, because this is the kind of stuff of like a Dolly Parton song. And actually, Dolly Parton has written an entire album inspired by this book of songs inspired by the story. And so you can see her with James Patterson here on the back of it. I've not listened to the album yet, but I just think this sounds like so much fun, and I'm so excited that Dolly Parton has published her debut novel, you know, at the age she is, and being such an icon she is, and a supporter of literature like she is. I'm just so happy to dive into this. I think it'll just be such an enjoyable experience. Also, the paperback for Crying in the H Mart by Michelle Zauner has just been published recently, and this is a book which was first published last year that I really wanted to get to. It was one of Obama's favorite books of the year, and in it the author describes her experiences with her Korean heritage, coming to terms with that as an American, and her family life. And she is a musician in a band, and my partner has actually been reading this and says it is really good. So that's another recommendation that makes me want to get to it. Another debut novel by a musician. I don't know why so many musicians are writing books, but this is William the Conqueror by Ruarri Joseph, and it's about a young man that wants to conquer the world and has a lot of dreams and aspirations, and feels like he's been raised by the music he's listened to, because he has a hippie mother and an absent father that just haven't played too much of parental roles in his life. And so it's about his journey traveling around to lots of different places and trying to discover himself, but coming against the cold realities of the world. Then I have a novel which is about a band, which is From Blue to Black by Joel Lane. And this is actually a reprint of a novel which was first published in 2000, or the early 2000s. And the author died a few years ago. And it's the story of a post-punk band in Birmingham in the 1990s, and the misadventures of various members of this band. And this is an era of British history, you know, before I moved here, that I'm not all that familiar with. So I think it would be really interesting to read this book, and I just like the collage effect of this cover. I also have some other reprints of older, more classic books. So first off, there's Latchkey Ladies by Marjorie Grant, and this was first published in 1921, and it follows the stories of a group of women in post-World War I London, and how they're living either alone or with other women, and how they're loosely connected with each other and all grappling with their own issues to do with this period of history. And so it's likened sort of to Mary McCarthy's The Group, or if you want to make the comparison with Sex and the City, you know, a group of women and their struggles and trials, you know, as young women in the city. And one of them has an affair with a married man and gets pregnant, and so it deals with the issues concerning that, and it just sounds so good. There's also a beautiful new cloth-bound Penguin edition of On the Road by Jack Kerouac, and this month is a special anniversary because it is 100 years since Jack Kerouac's birth. I think on March 12th was his birthday, and this is a novel that I read as a teenager, like a lot of teenagers, I think, read Jack Kerouac, you know, when they're teenagers, because it captures the mood of the Beat Generation and this kind of counterculture sense of going on a long road trip and experimenting with friendship and sex and drugs and capturing that whole experience. It'll be interesting revisiting this as an adult, because I'm sort of guessing I might have very different feelings about it now. Also, this past January would have been the 80th birthday of Derek Jarman, the filmmaker and writer, and so there are new reprints of two of his books. First, Dancing Ledge, which are his journals from a number of years, which give this sort of insider look into the making of some of his films, but also his process as an artist and his reflections about being a gay man living through the periods of the past few decades and becoming HIV positive, and so describing that whole experience, but also this book Pharmacopoeia, which is a journal from his time spent in Dungeness, which he bought a cottage there many years ago. There's this wonderful story of how he was just driving around this area of England, which is very rural and kind of starkly beautiful, and driving around with Tilda Swinton because he was friends with her, and he just saw this cottage and fell in love with it. So he bought it and he started living there, and he created and cultivated a garden while he was living there. So this is his notebooks following that process, but also recording his reflections about art and life, and yeah, so just sounds so wonderful. And I went to visit this cottage in Dungeness a few years ago, and yeah, just the whole landscape around it is so beautiful. You can't actually go into the cottage because it's still privately owned, but you can walk around it and see the garden that he created there and just like imagine his life living there. And so yeah, this will be like a wonderful way to revisit those experiences. This is a book that sounds so fascinating. It's Wreck by Tom Defrestin, and it's the story of how the author has been long fascinated by the painting The Raft of the Medusa by Gericault, which is this beautiful, terrifying painting depicting a scene from a 19th century tragedy where 150 people survived a shipwreck, but were stuck on a raft, and only 15 of them survived. And you can see the reproduction of this painting within the covers of this book. And it's about how he's been interested in the way that big tragedies have been depicted in artworks, and he's an artist himself and was working with a Syrian man that was blinded by a bomb to create artworks, and what it means to translate these tragedies into great artworks. And but it's also his reflections on his family life and the difficulty of his family life. And so yeah, it sounds like such a fascinating book, and it has some great blurbs on the back of it, including by Dorian Negrifa, who says that to read Wreck is to observe a mind as it delves into the pentimenti of the past, moving through complexities of horror, art, solidarity, and trauma. Unforgettable. I have a new poetry collection, and I don't read all that much poetry, but it's by Emily Berry, and it's called Unexhausted Time. And I loved her book, Stranger Baby, so much. Another book of poetry that I'm really eager to read more of her poems. And I believe a lot of these poems are meant to be about that kind of hazy time in our consciousness between sleeping and waking, where we're sort of having thoughts but also having dreams, and exploring that experience from a poetic perspective. And I just think that sounds so interesting. The Instant by Amy Liptrot, and this is a memoir detailing the author's experiences moving to Germany, where she was going to seek new experiences, and she found them, but not really in the way that she was expecting or wanted. And it's also exploring the natural environment of living in Germany. And I've not read this author's book, The Outrun, but I know that was highly praised and was like a winner of the Wainwright Prize, which is a nature writing prize I like to follow. So I'd be keen to try her writing. The Slowworm Song by Andrew Miller, and this is about a man living in Somerset that's trying to rekindle a relationship with his daughter that he's been estranged from for a while. But he receives a letter one day that calls him to an inquest occurring in Belfast about an incident that occurred during the Troubles in 1982 that he was involved in, and he's been trying to forget about this incident in his life, but obviously being called to give witness to it, it brings it all back to the surface and also causes issues between him and his daughter. And I've actually never read Andrew Miller before, or at least I don't think so. I think maybe I've read one novel of his before, but I know he's a very well-respected author, and I've been meaning to read more by him, or maybe start reading him for the first time. I don't know, if you've ever read Andrew Miller and would recommend his writing, let me know in the comments below. Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter by Lizzie Pook. And this is a historical novel set in 1886 when an English family moves to Australia in order to make a new life for themselves. And the father becomes a pearl hunter who goes out on a number of expeditions. And many years after they move there, on one such expedition, he goes missing, and his daughter wants to know what happened to him, and so she goes out in search of answers, but she finds a lot of danger. So this sounds like a really gripping and adventurous historical novel, and that has a gorgeous cover. Here again now by Okechukwu Nzelu, and this is about two young men living in Manchester. Both of them are Nigerian British, both of them are gay, and they've had a strong friendship with each other, but they also might have stronger feelings for each other. So it's about them wrestling with that relationship, but also one of their fathers has a lot of issues. He drinks a lot, and so his son takes him into his home. And so yeah, it's about their lives, about masculinity and about love and grief. And sounds like a really good story. I'd started reading this author's debut novel, but just didn't really get along with it, so I set it aside. But I'd like to try reading more of his writing. The Doloriad by Marjorie Williams, and this has such a striking cover, and the story also sounds very strange. It takes place after a mysterious environmental cataclysm which has wiped out a lot of humanity, and it follows a family that is living on the edges of a ruined city, and there's a lot of incest in this family, and how the matriarch of this family wants to connect with another family nearby, so offers her daughter Dolores, who doesn't have any legs, in marriage to this other family. And so following their story, which sounds quite harrowing, but it's been called strange and gothic, and I think it also just sounds fascinating. The Voids by Ryan O'Connor, and this is a novel about a man that's living in a condemned tower block in Glasgow, and the residents of this tower block slowly move away, and he is left there all by himself and contemplating his life, what he wants to do in his life, and what's become of his city and his neighborhood. And it sounds like such a haunting and beautifully moving story, and I've heard really good things about it, so I'm quite eager to read this. At Certain Points We Touch by Lauren John Joseph, and this is a novel about an individual that emerges from a nightclub and realizes that it's the birthday of someone that they had a very tumultuous but formative relationship with. And so it tunnels back to the past to describe the conflict of that relationship and why it meant so much to this individual. And I've been interested to read this author because I saw them speak actually at Charleston, the sort of home of the Bloomsbury Group, which has now become a museum, alongside Olivia Lane about the novel Orlando. They gave this talk when it was a certain anniversary for that novel, which was really interesting to hear them talk about it. And I guess they're friends because Olivia Lane also provided a quote for this debut novel, which she calls a stone-cold masterpiece, which in its scope, frankness, and ambition reminds me of the line of beauty retooled for the 21st century, by turns libidinous, hilarious, melancholy, and full of feeling. It reveals Lauren John Joseph as a shocking new talent. I also have a new science fiction novel, and I don't read all that much science fiction, but I think this just sounds like so much fun. It's called The Circus Infinite by Con Wan. It's about an individual named Jess that's a mixed race mixed-race, asexual empath with gravity manipulation abilities. So it was quite different from other people. And what do you do when you're kind of an outcast and very different from other people? You find other outcasts. And so he joins a circus on a pleasure moon in this galaxy and is on the run for certain reasons. And so yeah, I just think it sounds like such a pleasure. I also have an advanced copy of Patrick Gale's new novel called Mother's Boy, which has this very striking image on the cover of this proof. And this is the story of a woman in Cornwall in the early 20th century who is raising a boy as a single mother and working a lot of difficult jobs in order to be able to raise him. And he turns out to be a bit of a genius. And so it follows his story. He joins the Navy, but also develops desires which he feels like he can't openly discuss with his mother and other people. So yeah, following his story, I loved Patrick Gale's writing. I've read a number of his novels. They're just so beautiful and moving, and he talks about gay experience and places it within a historical context in a very interesting way. So I'm really looking forward to reading this, as well as many of these other books, hopefully soon, after I get through some of this work that I've been completely consumed with. But I'd love to know if you've read any of these books and would recommend them, or if you're interested in reading any of these books. Please let me know about that in the comments below, and let me know what I should start off reading. I know once I finally have some free reading time. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.